So good morning, everyone. Welcome to our show and tell for the CDPS Landscape Review. We have a lot to go through today. We have actually extended the length of our landscape review, and we'll talk a little bit about why and what we're going to do in the remaining time as we go through. But first of all, I guess a few of the usual house rules. We would love to hear everyone's questions. Feel free to put them in the chat, but we normally try and take questions at the end, and we'll cover those as well if we see them in the chat bar. We're going to be talking a little bit about what the landscape review is, very briefly, what we're going to have the last couple of weeks, and then what we're going to be doing in next steps and what we'd like to hear from you. So again, we'd love everyone to get involved. There's a couple of ways at the end we highlight how you can do that. So if we move on to the next slide, Henry. A quick reminder, very quick, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to understand and talk to as many people as we can across across public services in Wales, so that really helps CDPS understand what we need to do to make the biggest impact. The landscape review team are there on the right hand side. You'll be hearing from myself, Rick Stock, Henry, and Arthur today from the landscape review team. If we move on to the next slide, Henry. Just a quick slide showing and highlighting what we expect to have at the end of this. We will have a report, which we hope to be able to share. We will have a list, not of the entirety of all the services in Wales, obviously, but a good, useful list of services that we've talked to and heard from organisations. We'll have some idea of what CDPS will then do, and a view of how much that will cost, and a roadmap as well, both for CDPS and also for public services in Wales more widely. And we'll have a big long list of people who we've talked to, which will be fantastically useful for CDPS going forward. So if we move on to the next slide, we have talked to a lot of people, I think is the summary of this. There is always more to talk to, but I think we're making some really good progress across the 4 sectors that we decided to look at, and you can see how that list is building up. We move on to the next slide, Henry. This gives, I guess, a little bit of a recap of how many we wanted to talk to in this alpha phase, which is the second phase of landscape review. The summary here is it's looking really good in certain areas. We've exceeded our original goals, going a little slower in others, and hence we've taken the decision to run the landscape review a little longer to allow us to get to as many people as we possibly can. But the calendar is looking full, and we're really optimistic that we'll be able to get back on track. So we move on to the next slide and over to Henry.
Thanks, Rick. So I'll then talk through some of the things that we found out, particularly in the last 2 weeks. So the key step forward that we've taken in the last 2 weeks is to move from what we call those breadth of services discussions, where we've met with the leader of a public service to talk about the range of services they organise, to actually running focus groups with people who are running specific services. So, for example, the person who runs the Borrow From the Museum Collection Service at the National Museum for Wales, that kind of person. What we've broadly been doing is inviting typically about 5 service owners from a particular organisation to come together and both tell us about their service and tell us about how they run it, but also to speak to each other about the opportunities and challenges that they face in delivering their service. We've then drawn out some of the key themes that have come out just in that first set of services. First set of focus groups with many more to come. And what we've done is just try and draw out where we're hearing slightly different things across different areas of public services. So 5 themes that I'll call out firstly at a high level and then go through in a bit more detail. You'll see on the left, we've got some things which we particularly heard from local government and sponsored bodies, and we're seeing more kind of shared things over there. So thinking about a shift to doing more user research and trying to think about user journeys, but also maybe some different approaches in how we actually get that input from the people using our services. Also thinking about collaboration between organisations, and again, just hearing about many different approaches of how people are thinking about doing this. Over on the Welsh Government side, we've heard a lot more about information security and regulation, and that being a concern for those service owners, more so than we've heard in local government and sponsored bodies. But then in the middle, two things that we've heard really across the board is a real concern about accessibility and digital inclusion, which we can come on to, and then also some interesting findings about how ICT and digital teams are working with more customer-focused teams, where we don't necessarily have integrated service teams. We've got these different functions, and we're hearing about how they work together. If I then go on to talk more about what we've actually heard, so on this point about user research, we've been really pleased that really all organisations we've spoken to have talked about wanting to shift towards thinking about their user needs more and starting to map out user journeys. And actually, that's been a key part of many of the organisations we're speaking to, a key part of their strategy going forwards. What we found when we then talk about their approach to user research, there is a range of ways of doing that. I think probably many, or maybe the majority of organisations spoken to, their user research tends to involve surveys, of sending out a survey to their users, and also kind of internal user journey mapping. So where the team is coming around a whiteboard and kind of thinking about what their users need from the service. What we're seeing less is really sitting down with someone who's using that service, sitting down with them while they have a go at it and actually talking through that process and maybe getting more of that two-way conversation about how people are experiencing the service. I think the other thing that's interesting to draw out is that often we're seeing user research being done as a distinct part of the development process of the service, but we're not necessarily seeing that be come back to in an iterative way and kind of continually having that discussion with users, or necessarily thinking about it once the service is running. Then we've got this finding, which was across all organisations, about integrating digital and customer teams. And this is where we're seeing many organisations have, they don't necessarily run a kind of single multidisciplinary service teams. So they don't necessarily have a distinct group of people who are thinking about borrowing from the museum collections. Instead, organisations tend to have a particular ICT and a particular digital team, and then they'll also have a number of customer teams that are thinking about those different service needs. And we've heard back from service owners that it's not that those different groups are not always as connected as they'd like to be. And you often have that kind of separation where the customer team is the one who's actually going out and speaking to people. The ICT and digital team is thinking about those back-end functions. They're thinking about accessibility, but they're not always as close as they'd like to be. So that's something that we like to think about in terms of the projects that we're doing. I will say this quote at the bottom left is a really nice example of an organisation that is really thinking about this, and it's definitely not the case that there's always that separation. With this organisation, talking about that they're trying to look at all of their services in an end-to-end way, thinking about both the customer-facing bit and the internal bit together at the same time. On the next slide then, this was more from the local government and sponsored bodies area, but where we're hearing really all organisations are really proactively thinking about how they can learn from each other and how they can work together. I think the thing that we found interesting is how many different approaches are being taken to get that kind of collaboration. So we've heard about areas where kind of regional organisations have come together to have a much closer conversation about their services, where they've actually combined their services to deliver together. We've seen cases where individual organisations are running a service for a number of other organisations, and we've seen groups of organisations that are sharing code sharing platforms, so that they can actually, when they develop something, they can really easily offer it up to other local authorities that might be interested in using it. What we'd like to then think about is, across all of these different ways of approaching this, are there some that are more effective in different places? Are there some that are overall working better, and that's something we can learn from? And again, that's something we want to look at through the service teams that we're running. If I go on, so accessibility and digital inclusion is something that's really come up through all of the focus groups that we've run. We know that there's a lot of information already out there about meeting accessibility needs, and there's data on digital inclusion and levels of connectivity, but we're still just really getting this back that this is a big concern for public services. It's something on the mind of service owners. So we feel like there is something that we can do to try and help demystify this and point to the really practical steps that we can do to be confident that our services are including everyone and are accessible. And then the final of the 5 is about information security and regulation. And as I said at the beginning, this is something that's more so come out of Welsh Government services than the other areas. But again, we've heard this repeatedly coming back, that this is something that that these service owners are really thinking about. It is a concern, and it is an area that we'd like to try and support and try and make to make those practical steps as clear as possible. I think this particularly comes into our thinking and work on the service standards, which currently are shared and are understood by many people. But we haven't yet got to that point of setting out the really practically, how do you make sure that your service meets those standards? So I think that's a big next step for us. So then we mentioned before that we're building this list of services. And again, we've heard of about 250 services across Welsh Government sponsored bodies and health and care organisations. And simultaneously, we have a list of the services typically delivered by local authorities, given that there's so much overlap between them, of about 120. And both of these are still growing and still being developed. What we started to think about in the last 2 weeks is adding some structure to that list, and starting to analyse where the kind of shared components or shared areas might be, where we could actually look to work together, or we could look to build something really effective in the future. There's 2 types of structure that we're adding to this list. One is thinking about the user needs within that long list of services, and seeing if we can start to find any commonalities between those user needs. An approach that many other organisations have taken in the past is to look at the verbs that define those services, and then really thinking about those verbs, because they might lead on to some design patterns for particular services. So actually, is there an effective way? Is there an effective design pattern for a service that's helping you to hire people, for example? So we've just been looking through that service list and categorizing them into this, recognizing that this doesn't work for everything in that list. The second thing we've been doing is then looking at components within services. And for this, it is a many-to-many relationship, in that a particular service might have 5 or 6 of these components. We're thinking about this because we'd like to see that kind of 80-20 list, and see which of these components are actually most commonly used by different services. And that's something that we're working through at the moment. To make this a little bit more real, here is just an example of doing this for a particular service. So we've got this user need from the National Library for Wales, that as a media professional, I want to film in the library. The information that we've then gathered from them is around, so we've had a conversation with the National Library about what this service involves, and we understand that the service is currently non-digital, and it is run by an internal team. We've then mapped this as a requesting service to again more broadly categorize that user need, and we've then gone through and looked at which of the components are actually present in this service. So there is a need to have a two-way conversation. They are collecting files or attachments from someone who's applying to them for that. They are potentially taking payments, and they are needing to store information about what is booked. And again, this is all building up so that in the end, we'd like to be able to say that actually 60% of services do require collecting text information. Meanwhile, only 20% require taking payments, just giving us that sense of where the more common components are. Then quite a different piece of work that we've been doing over the last 2 weeks, but very strongly tied to the costed roadmap that we're working on, is thinking about CDPS's service offering. So at the moment, these are really initial conversations, starting to think about broadly what are the ways that CDPS can most effectively support and work with other public services. But this is really key to the costed roadmap in giving us a sense of the different areas that we should be focusing on where from all of that information we've gathered from service owners do we really want to focus. We've started then with 4 key questions, which maybe I'll run through quickly. So thinking about what should the balance be between providing broad guidance and support across public services versus providing focused support to selected areas. And that's kind of thinking about, do we want to go and work with one organization in a really deep way over the course of months to really improve a particular service, or do we want to try and do something more scalable where we can bring in people from 100 organizations at once? And probably the answer is that we want to get a balance, but that's something we're thinking about. How much do we want to become the standards keeper for all of the public sector versus a supporter and enabler on specific issues? Should CDPS design, host, or run platforms and components for the benefit of the rest of public services? So do we want to, how much do we want to take that in ourselves? And then finally, thinking through, are there any kind of ways of working with other organizations or models for a project that we wouldn't want to take? We've had some sessions this week with the CDPS board and also with Glyn and Sam, the CDOs for Welsh Government and local government respectively. But in the future, we're hoping to talk this through also with our internal team and with the CDPS advisory board. I'm now going to pass on to Arthur to talk about technology.
Hey everyone. We have 2 technical surveys that we've been going through with stakeholders, one targeted towards services and one targeted towards organizations. So far we've had, in Alpha, we've had 9 responses back. So a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about we're obviously extrapolating out, and it's also we're also interpreting some of it based on conversations we've had as well. So the responses we've had back primarily from IT departments or digital departments, most of those submitting by heads of IT. In the architecture and systems questions that we've been asking, the respondents for the organizational survey did manage much better to define their tech stack as opposed to the services survey, which struggled a little bit more to define that, and that maybe means that we have to pull that out slightly more in conversations as opposed to going down the survey route. And also from the organization survey, it provides slightly less insight into services because we need to be able to define between whether this architecture, this infrastructure is service specific or for line of business systems. That said, it has become clear that Microsoft systems are very prevalent, using things like Microsoft Azure for cloud hosting and infrastructure, using Microsoft Dynamics for customer relationship management, for marketing, and in some place for content management. And obviously standard Office 365 for Outlook, Excel, etc. In the service operation, we saw from the responses we've had, we've seen quite a significant variation in how often services are updated, between very rarely to potentially more than once a month, once a fortnight. Now, what we want to investigate going forward in future discussions is whether this is potentially down to a lack of need to update services, whether they don't need to be updated, or whether it's down to a lack of skill set or development capacity, funding, or something different. Also, one of the things that came out was there appears to be little application telemetry gathering. So this is kind of gathering logs, having metrics or alerts for system outages. So enabling more proactive response to service outages as opposed to reacting when a system goes down, for example, but also gathering management information on recovery from that. So so being able to report on when a system went down, when it was about to go down, and being able to generate information like mean time to recovery and those kind of things. So again, this is slightly extrapolated from the number of responses we've had back, but it's something that we want to investigate in future interviews. On the changing your service, so how services are changed. Again, it wasn't a uniform picture across the responses that we had, but most of the respondents did report doing changes in-house via a centralized ticketing system, with some respondents also reporting third-party partner support for development or third-line support, those kind of things. And from a software as a service, again, that was all largely standard, as I mentioned before, with the predominantly Microsoft services. When it comes to software as a service, again, it was largely standard things, Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, those kind of things. And also one thing that we have seen is a minimal use of gov.uk products. So by far gov.notify is the most common gov.uk product used, but across the board we've seen quite minimal use of those. In the hosting services, a lot of the survey responses that we got back reported that a large proportion of it of services were self-hosted and on-premise. However, based on conversations we've had, we think this is perhaps down to unsupervised responses of the survey, and again, what I mentioned before about whether these on-premise self-hosted servers are more line of business as opposed to actually inline for running services. And so again, we're going to investigate that further. That said, of the on-premise servers that were reported, it was quite an even split over Windows and common Linux distros, but we did see a certain number of respondents reporting unsupported operating systems, versions of operating systems in there. So that's again something to look at. But on the slightly more positive side, when it comes to actual user devices, so laptops, mobiles, we didn't see kind of any indication of running old hardware. So while some devices were going up to 4 years, roughly respondents were saying it was around 2 years, cyclically replacing them, sometimes down to 1 year old devices. So that's positive. I think I'll hand over to Rick.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, Henry. So we are just wrapping up now, a little kind of view of what our next steps are. So the overall landscape review has sort of a kind of a first of all initial organization level, and then we go into detailed service groups with any particular organization. So we have a load more of those in the diary coming up over the next kind of couple of weeks. We have more technology interviews following on from those conversations that Arthur was just describing with more organizations, and really kind of following up to progress that work, as Henry was saying, to understand where the costed roadmap will be kind of driving its direction, providing emphasis based on the feedback we hear from all of the stakeholders we're talking to. Our next show and tell, I think we've been saying that they're going to be every Friday, but we actually have now moved this to a Tuesday based on some feedback we had from our colleagues in local authorities who tell us that Friday is a bad day to have a show and tell. So we're very happy to move that to a Tuesday. Also helps us with a couple of meeting clashes as well that we've got. So the next one is on the 23rd. If we move on to the next slide, just a quick reminder, if you want to get involved, always get in touch with us via that digital landscape review email address. I think many of the people we got on the call we've already spoken to, so hopefully we're talking to you one-to-one already. Definitely some familiar faces out there today, and really great to see such a good attendance. Another plea, I guess, from Arthur, I think as Arthur was mentioned, we've had about 9 of the tech survey responses. If you haven't done so already, it'd be great to get in touch with your tech leads to really kind of drive forward and make sure that we get the right number of responses there. And again, we've had a really good take up from our focus group so far, but another request to make sure you kind of keep supporting us in the conversations with your teams there. As always, all of the previous show and tells are on YouTube, and this one will be too. But that really brings us to the end of this week's show and tell. Many thanks all for listening, and let's see if there are any questions. Glyn, over to you. Oh, I think you're on mute.
You're not on Teams mute. It seems you're muted by some other part of your tech.
It's me.
Maybe let Andrew go first. Andrew, do you want to come in there? Glyn, we'll come back to you.
Yeah, very interesting to hear sort of what other technology and software platforms people are running. I'm wondering whether you've got any plans to actually publish some kind of map across the public sector organisations, so we can see who's using what, because it'd be really good to help us to develop collaborations and to do knowledge sharing. You mentioned one in particular, for example, where they're using a module on one of their systems that we want to investigate over the next few months. So it'd be great to actually have some Welsh comparators. I think that'd be a really useful way of starting to form some communities of practice.
So I think what exactly we'll publish, and how we'll publish that, we need to still discuss and work out the fine details of that. But we would really like to share as much as we possibly can. So yes, there are obviously some restrictions that we need to be a little bit careful about, some of the more sensitive details there. But to be honest, Andrew, if there is anything that you've picked up there in particular, we're very happy to do that introduction right now. So feel free to get in contact. Glyn, I'm going to try and go back to you.
Still no audio, it seems.
Okay. Maybe put the question in the chat bar. Does anyone else want to come in there where we just give Glyn a little bit more time to resolve the microphone issues? Deb.
Hopefully, there we go. Yeah, some of the joining by browser sucks, as I've discovered. So trying to get some of the settings to work. So it might be colleagues are having the same sort of problems. Yeah, so I am head of digital strategy in health care. So I work with Glyn, Janine and colleagues, and it's great to see some of the engagement and the work that you've been doing with colleagues over in the health sector. And I can imagine some of the responses that you're getting back from our colleagues in terms of the complexity and some of the work that we're doing around systems is probably quite comprehensive. I lead on cybersecurity policy, and some of the work that we're doing to scope systems in there says that an average health board has at least 10,000 systems that they work with. I've got pieces to try and unpick some of that. I'm not expecting anyone to get into the sort of levels of depth. That's where we come in. But some of the work that you're doing around standards looks fascinating, and understanding some of those user journeys, etc. And I think there's definitely some crossover work that we could look at in terms of what that would mean. For example, in a health context, you can imagine a lot of our work is patient facing, so thinking about what does that mean, but also being able to show what does it mean for different kinds of users. So I'm very interested in where others may have services where there's multiple different types of users trying to access a certain service. So for example, we've got patients, members of the public who are not necessarily receiving treatment. So you've got everybody, you've then got clinicians and pieces all kind of using the service in different ways, and then trying to build a complex service with lots and lots of different user demands. So that's some of the challenges I'm facing at the moment. It's good to see that through some of your work, hopefully we might be able to start trying to find some of the best ways of designing some of those services going forward.
Absolutely. And I think there's lots of opportunities to work together and to join up on that. Sally, do you want to come in there at all? I know there's a lot other conversations going on in the health space.
Yeah, in fact, over the past sort of few months, or month and a half or so, it's been all about health, which has been fantastic. We have been working with the health colleagues Anne has been working in Velindre. We're on the DSPP board. We are speaking to Powys Wellbeing. So the relationships is really brilliant, actually, and we're really enjoying it. Although you put your head up and you think, oh, how can we help you health? Like, wow, okay, fab. But we're more than happy to. So obviously I have weekly meetings with EFAN, and new and brilliant ideas are coming up. So I would say that I know you're swamped. I know there's lots of work going on, but on our last conversation with Philip, God, I must never call him Phil, he will kill me, is to look at what more we can do together. I think I've got a very bad connection, apologies.
We heard you loud and clear. The video.
Did you hear me?
Yeah, that was all good. So thanks to follow up on that.
Thanks.
I'm gonna, if it's okay, I'm gonna go try and see if we can go through Glyn's questions that he's put in the chat. So the first one was, when you hear a local authority say a common platform won't work for us, we want something different to our neighbouring local authority. Do we probe into this at all? I'm going to bring Henry in there in a minute, but I think that the short answer is yes, we do. We definitely will around the service conversations, we try and probe in particular to understand, I guess, what the user need is, and then how that's being implemented, so that we can try and pull out some of the detail from all the services we talk to. But Henry, anything to add there?
Yeah, I was just, because I think there was a particular quote up on the slide, and I've managed to go and find our kind of more detailed notes from that person. I think in that case, I think they talked about some of the, I think, specific previous services where they felt like that hasn't ended up working for them. I think they called out Wikis as a platform that has been a challenge, but they also talked about a service. So that this was a local authority, talked about a service that they were running with their local health board. There was I think a different national platform, and they found it really frustrating that they were trying to move forward with their local health board, the two of them together, but they were still held back by that national team. I don't have what service it was, but that was something they talked about. So some additional insight. It's not, these have typically been in kind of broad discussions with an organization about kind of the range of things they do. So we haven't had a really detailed discussion, but we do have a bit more there.
And I think probably just to highlight that, where we've had broad conversations and we start to pull these out, the landscape review has another phase, and there is other work that we can do with other services within CDPS, so we can highlight, that we'll go into a deeper level of investigation, going forward. Looking at the second question there, digital inclusion came as a theme from the group, which you're asking questions about digital inclusion approaches to service owners. We've had quite broad conversations about digital inclusion, and I think as Henry was saying in the slides there, definitely there is a receptive audience for conversations about digital inclusion, about sharing data, about really understanding what work's been done already. So I think, again, another good area for further study. And then the third one is the fact Welsh Government are more focused on the security elements indicative there is a lack of awareness in the other sectors, or just they raise other things as a higher priority on their worry list. I think it's the latter, but sometimes it's the former is the short answer. We spoke to some people who were very much prioritizing cyber. I can think of an example with a sponsor body we spoke to, who had spent a lot of time on training and skills development around cyber, and it was very much at the top of their mind, but they felt that they had a good handle on it. Maybe a different picture with others, so quite a varied picture there. But I think the probably reflected in the kind of, I think the slides that Henry was showing earlier around Welsh Government seemed to be a particular kind of focus and priority. Henry, anything to add on that one there?
I don't think particularly. Yeah, I think you've covered it well.
Okay. Let me just look through the chat. Oh, I think we've covered everything there.
I have just put a follow-up just to that question one. Sorry, I've understood my own notes a little bit better. It was the case that a local authority was running actual ICT services for themselves and their local health board, and they perceived that the national systems were holding them back from being able to move forward with their local setup, in particular that they were held back from moving to cloud, and were having to stay more on premise than they would have liked to in their local area.
So some really interesting and insightful questions there. Do we have any more questions at this point? And probably just a flag, as per the last couple of slides, very, very happy to hear more from people about questions directed to the team if they occur to you at a later date. Okay, in which case I think I'm going to draw this to a close. Really appreciate the conversation today. Thank you again for your time. We know everyone's super busy. Have a great rest of Friday and a good weekend. Thanks all.
Thanks all.